They found the research team frozen solid in a room that was 73 degrees Fahrenheit. Not hypothermia, not gradual, frozen. Ice crystals in their eyes, their blood crystallized in their veins, their last breaths hanging in the air like glass sculptures, and the heating system was still running. I'm looking at the file now, folder 884 Sigma 7, stamped with a classification so high it doesn't even have a name, just a symbol. A circle with a dot in the center like a target or a lens. The paper is brittle, nearly 40 years old, and there are water stains along the edges. Melted frost, maybe, from whatever freezer they kept this in before it reached the archive. The thumbnail notation, written in red pen across the cover. Cold is not the absence of heat. Cold is a direction. Let me tell you about Northern Lens. The project began in January 1981 at Installation 76, buried in the Kola Peninsula, 200 kilometers above the Arctic Circle. A place where winter lasts 9 months and the sun doesn't rise for 6 weeks every year. They chose the location deliberately, somewhere cold enough that the baseline temperature would mask the experiments. Somewhere isolated enough that screaming wouldn't carry. The official designation was Directed Thermal Manipulation Research. The scientists called it Northern Lens. Not because it was located in the north, though it was, but because of what it did. It focused cold the way a magnifying glass focuses light. The principal investigator was Dr. Yuri Stavinsky, a thermodynamics researcher who'd published 17 papers on heat transfer before the KGB recruited him in 1979. His early work was theoretical, mathematical, the kind of physics that lives entirely on blackboards. But something in his equations caught someone's attention. Some implication that temperature differentials could be weaponized in ways that violated common sense. I'm reading his initial proposal now. The language is careful, almost apologetic, as if he knew what he was suggesting sounded insane. Heat naturally flows from hot to cold. This is the second law of thermodynamics, but the law does not specify the rate or method of transfer. If thermal energy could be directionally extracted rather than simply allowed to dissipate, theoretical models suggest the possibility of creating localized temperature gradients of unprecedented magnitude. Not cooling in the conventional sense, but targeted thermal harvesting. Thermal harvesting. He's describing stealing heat from one place and concentrating the absence, the cold, somewhere else. The Politburo funded him within 3 weeks. The apparatus they built, I'm trying to visualize it from these technical drawings, but the schematics hurt to look at. Not because they're complex, though they are, but because the geometry is wrong. The core component was a series of concentric rings, each one made from a different metal alloy. Copper, bismuth, something called thermally asymmetric gallium composite that I can't find any reference to outside this file. The rings rotated, not mechanically. They had no motor, no external power source. They rotated in response to temperature differentials, spinning faster as the environment grew warmer, slower as it cooled. The description says they were self-sustaining through ambient thermal harvesting. They fed on the heat around them to keep moving. At the center, the focal point, was what Stavinsky called the collection aperture. A hollow sphere, 30 centimeters in diameter, made from some kind of ceramic material that stayed cold no matter what. The technical specifications list its resting temperature as minus 40 degrees Celsius, but there's a handwritten note in the margin. Lower bounds unknown. Material temperature appears limited only by ambient availability of the thermal energy. In plain language, it got colder as long as there was heat nearby to steal. The outer ring was 4 meters in diameter. When operational, the entire assembly would spin, the rings moving at different speeds, creating these rotating temperature gradients that... This is where the physics breaks down for me, that somehow amplified and directed the thermal extraction. One of the early test reports describes it like this. Device creates a cone of thermal negation extending from the aperture. Within this cone, heat is extracted at a rate exceeding natural thermodynamic equilibrium by factors of 103 to 105. Effect is cumulative and self-reinforcing. They'd built a weapon that didn't freeze things. It removed heat so efficiently that matter had no time to adapt, just transformed directly from warm to frozen in seconds. The first successful test was conducted February 19, 1981. Target: a laboratory mouse in a containment chamber 15 meters from the device. I'm reading the observation log. The technician's handwriting is steady at first, then deteriorates. 1403, device activated. Ring rotation achieved optimal speed within 30 seconds. 1404, temperature in target chamber drops from 22 to 15. Mouse exhibits normal behavior. 1405, temperature now 3. Mouse shows signs of distress, attempting to climb chamber walls. 1406, temperature minus 12. Mouse has ceased movement. Visible frost formation on chamber interior. 1407, temperature minus 40 Taisu. Mouse appears to have frozen mid-movement, one paw extended. Chamber walls covered in ice crystals half a centimeter thick. 1408, device deactivated. Total test duration, 5 minutes. Then 3 lines down, underlined twice. Post-test examination reveals mouse frozen through completely. Tissue samples shatter when touched. Internal organs show crystalline structure identical to ice formed in deep cryogenic conditions. Time from normal body temperature to complete crystallization, approximately 90 seconds. 90 seconds. The mouse didn't freeze to death. It was transformed into ice while still alive, so quickly that its nervous system had no time to register what was happening. Dr. Stavinsky's notes from that day are almost gleeful. The mathematics were correct. We can focus cold, we can aim it. They scaled up immediately. Within 2 weeks, they were testing on larger animals. Dogs, primarily. Strays collected from nearby villages, each one assigned a number instead of a name. The reports are clinical, detached, but certain details leak through the bureaucratic language. Test subject 47, a German shepherd, approximately 4 years old. Placed in a containment room 20 meters from the device. Duration of exposure 3 minutes. Subject exhibited acute distress beginning at T plus 90 seconds. Attempted to escape containment. Vocalizations ceased at T plus 140 seconds. Complete thermal cessation achieved at T plus 180 seconds. Post-examination shows subject frozen in a running position. All 4 legs extended, mouth open. Eyes remain transparent. Flash frozen before biochemical cloud formation could occur. The eyes. They keep mentioning the eyes. How they stayed clear, glassy, perfectly preserved, because the cold hit so fast that even the natural decomposition of death had no time to begin. By March, they'd tested the device 43 times. Every test successful. Every subject frozen solid in conditions that should have been impossible. Rooms that, according to thermal sensors, never dropped below comfortable ambient temperature anywhere except in the direct path of the device's focus. One researcher, name redacted, wrote in a personal log, "The air around the subjects stays warm." You can stand next to the chamber and feel nothing unusual. But inside the cone, inside the focus, heat simply ceases to exist. It's not extracted gradually. It's deleted, erased. I don't have better words. That phrase appears in several reports. The cone. The focused beam of cold that extended from the device's aperture, growing narrower and more intense with distance, like light through a lens. At 20 meters, the cone was 3 meters wide. At 50 meters, it narrowed to less than 1 meter. But the intensity increased exponentially. They measured temperatures inside the cone at 50 meters, minus 180 degrees Celsius. Colder than the coldest natural temperature ever recorded on Earth. Colder than the boiling point of liquid nitrogen. And the device was just idling. They hadn't even tested it at full capacity. The accident happened on March the 31st, 1981. I've read this section a dozen times, trying to understand what went wrong, but the reports contradict each other. Multiple witnesses, multiple accounts, none of them quite agreeing on the sequence of events. What's certain, they were conducting a long-duration test. Target was a chimpanzee, test subject 91, placed in a reinforced containment chamber 30 meters from the device. The plan was to activate northern lens for 10 minutes, the longest sustained operation attempted so far. Dr. Stavinsky was in the observation room. 4 other researchers with him, plus 3 technicians monitoring the equipment. All of them behind reinforced glass, watching through the viewing port. At 6 minutes, something changed. Senior Technician Volkov's report. Ring rotation began to accelerate beyond programmed parameters. Speed increased by 300% in approximately 15 seconds. Aperture temperature dropped below measurement threshold. Our sensors only read to minus 200 degrees. Another account from Dr. Marianova. The sound changed. The rings had always hummed. This low vibration you felt more than heard. But at 6 minutes, the pitch shifted, higher, almost like singing, and the air in the observation room started to feel thin. At 7 minutes, the containment chamber's viewing window frosted over. Not from inside, from outside. Ice formed on glass that should have been room temperature, spreading in fractal patterns that looked almost organic. At 8 minutes, test subject 91 stopped moving, stopped breathing, transformed into a sculpture of ice that held its shape perfectly, fingers clutching the chamber bars, mouth open in a silent scream. At 9 minutes, the chamber walls began to crack. Dr. Stavinsky ordered an emergency shutdown. The technicians tried. I'm reading their desperate notes written during the event. Manual override non-responsive. Device not accepting shutdown commands. Ring rotation continuing to increase. Aperture temperature now beyond any reference point. Theory suggests the sentence ends mid-word. At 9 minutes, 40 seconds, the observation room viewing port shattered. The aftermath report is 3 pages long and reads like a fever dream. The viewing port was reinforced glass, 1/2 meter thick, designed to withstand small explosions. It didn't just break, it shattered from the inside out, blown backward into the observation room by pressure differentials that shouldn't have existed. And the cold followed. Immediate temperature drop in observation room from 24 degrees to minus 30 degrees in approximately 5 seconds. All personnel attempted to evacuate but were overcome before reaching exit. Emergency response team arrived within 4 minutes. Found all 7 individuals deceased from rapid onset hypothermia. But here's what makes me close the file and walk away for a while. The bodies. They weren't just frozen. They were frozen in layers. The report describes concentric rings of ice formation, as if the cold had hit them in waves, each one deeper and more complete than the last. Their skin was covered in frost patterns that spiraled inward, following the exact geometry of the device's rotating rings. One body, Dr. Stavinsky's, was found standing upright, one hand extended toward the emergency shutdown panel. He'd been flash frozen mid-step, so perfectly preserved that when the response team first saw him, they thought he was still alive. Just standing there, absolutely still, ice crystals growing from his eyelashes. The room temperature, when they finally got sensors in there, 73 degrees Fahrenheit. Comfortable. Warm. The heating system had never stopped working, but the bodies measured minus 60 degrees Celsius internally. Frozen solid in a room that was warm enough to require no jacket. The investigation report tries to explain what happened. I'm reading it now, watching the language fracture as the investigators realize they're describing something that violates thermodynamics. Preliminary analysis suggests device achieved critical resonance state, creating self-sustaining thermal extraction field. Rather than focusing cold in single direction, device appears to have established multiple focal points simultaneously, including one within observation room, despite presence of reinforced barrier. Multiple focal points. The lens had learned to split its beam to focus cold in several directions at once. One investigator, a physicist named Dr. Korzin, added a personal note to his report. Standard thermodynamic models cannot account for observed phenomena. Heat does not simply disappear, it must go somewhere. Northern Lens appears to be transporting thermal energy not just spatially, but elsewhere. When I calculate the total heat extracted from affected areas, the numbers suggest the energy is being removed from our local thermodynamic system entirely. This should be impossible. Elsewhere, he's suggesting that the device wasn't just moving heat around. It was deleting it from reality, sending it somewhere outside our physics. The margin next to that paragraph has a single word stamped in red ink. Censored. They tried to dismantle the device on April 7th. 6 engineers in full thermal suits, working in shifts of 10 minutes each to avoid prolonged exposure. The apparatus had been inactive since the accident. The rings completely still, the aperture dim. But here's the thing. The aperture was still cold. 8 days after shutdown, with no power source, no thermal gradient to feed on, the ceramic sphere at the device's center measured minus 35 degrees Celsius, just sitting there, passively cold, like it had forgotten how to be any other temperature. Engineer Petrov's log. Attempted to remove outer ring using hydraulic clamps. Metal is frozen to mounting brackets. Applied heating torch to break ice seal. Torch flame deflected around ring, not extinguished, but redirected, as if cold is creating barrier. Heating had no effect on ice. They abandoned the attempt after 3 hours. The rings wouldn't move, the aperture wouldn't warm, and every minute spent near the device left the engineers shaking and exhausted, despite their thermal gear. Final disposition order, dated April 15th, 1981. Installation 76 to be sealed and abandoned. Northern Lens device to remain in situ. Facility to be reclassified as hazardous containment site. All research materials to be archived under maximum security protocol. No further investigation authorized. They just left it there. Sealed the laboratory, welded the doors shut, buried the access tunnel under 6 meters of permafrost. The entire installation, everything they'd built, abandoned because they couldn't figure out how to safely approach their own creation. But the file doesn't end there. There are updates, reports from subsequent years, documenting the site's containment status. 1983. Thermal anomalies detected extending 200 meters from sealed laboratory. Ground temperature in affected area averages -10 despite summer conditions. Plant life in region shows no growth. 1986. Anomaly zone has expanded to 500-meter radius. Permafrost layer has thickened by 3 meters. Recommend extended monitoring. 1989. Local wildlife avoids area entirely. No mammals, no birds, no insects detected within 1 kilometer radius. Temperature measurements show gradual cooling trend continues. Central point, directly above sealed laboratory, now measures -40 year-round. The device has been off for 8 years in that last report. Sealed, buried, inactive. But the cold is still growing, still spreading outward like ripples from a stone dropped in a pond. Except the ripples aren't fading, they're getting stronger. The final document in the folder is a meteorological survey from 1994, 13 years after the accident. Some routine climate study that happened to include the Kola Peninsula in its data set. The researchers noted an unusual phenomenon. A persistent, low-pressure system centered approximately 200 kilometers above the Arctic Circle. Temperature at the center of this system measured consistently 15 to 20 degrees below surrounding areas. Anomaly appears stable and self-sustaining. No conventional meteorological explanation for localized cooling of this magnitude and persistence. Recommend further investigation. The coordinates they provide place the anomaly directly above Installation 76. I've cross-referenced this with more recent data, climate records from the last decade. The cold spot is still there, still growing. Now it measures 30 degrees below ambient, and it's large enough to appear on satellite thermal imaging. A permanent wound in the temperature map. A lens of cold that's been focusing for over 40 years, fed by nothing but its own existence. There's a loose page tucked in the back of the folder. Not official documentation, just a letter, handwritten, dated March 1992. It's addressed to the director of the archive, but there's no indication it was ever sent. I was one of the engineers who attempted to dismantle Northern Lens in 1981. I'm writing because I think you should know. We didn't fail because we couldn't move the rings or warm the aperture. We failed because the device was still operating. Not active, but operating. Like the difference between a fire that's burning and a coal that's still hot. The rings had stopped moving, but they were still harvesting. Still pulling heat from everything around them, just slowly, gradually, sustainably. Dr. Stavinsky designed it to be self-sustaining, to feed on ambient thermal energy and use that energy to continue its function. What none of us considered, what happens when a self-sustaining system has no off switch? It's still running, right now, under all that ice and earth. The rings turning so slowly you'd never see the movement. The aperture drawing in heat molecule by molecule, year after year, focusing cold the way it was built to do. Stavinsky's equations predicted the device could operate indefinitely. I think he was wrong. I think it can operate longer than indefinitely. I think it can operate until there's no more heat to steal, until everything around it reaches absolute zero, and physics stops working entirely. I'm 63 years old. I won't live to see what happens when a device like that has another 40 years to focus, but someone will. The letter isn't signed. I keep thinking about that phrase from Dr. Stavinsky's original proposal. Cold is not the absence of heat. cold is a direction. He wasn't wrong. Northern Lens proved that cold could be focused, directed, weaponized. That temperature isn't just a measurement, but a force that could be bent and shaped and aimed like light through glass. But I think he missed something. Something the device itself discovered during those 9 minutes before it killed him. Cold isn't just a direction. Cold is hunger. The rings keep spinning under the permafrost. The aperture keeps stealing heat from the earth, from the air, from the fabric of space itself. And every year the frozen zone grows a little larger, a little deeper, a little more permanent. 43 years of feeding, 43 years of focusing. I wonder what happens when it runs out of heat to steal from the ground and starts reaching higher, pulling thermal energy from the atmosphere, from clouds, from sunlight itself. I wonder if that cold spot on the satellite maps will keep growing until it's not just a spot anymore, but a region, a zone, an entirely new climate carved into the planet by a machine that learned to focus cold and never learned to stop. The folder is closed. I'm putting it back in the archive, filing it under the symbol that isn't quite a letter, isn't quite a number. Just that circle with the dot in the center, a lens, or a target, or both. Before I seal it away, I notice one more detail. At the very bottom of the last page, in pencil, nearly invisible, the device is patient. Cold has all the time in the world. They built a weapon that focuses cold. But I think what they actually built was something that teaches the universe to forget how to be warm. And somewhere in the Kola Peninsula, buried under meters of frozen earth, the rings are still turning. Still teaching, still focusing. This is Red Archive Stories. I'm Ian Cartwell. The Cold War ended, but some weapons don't know how to stop fighting.